1. The locked room in my grandpa's basement. When my grandfather passed away, he left me his old farmhouse. It was remote, quiet, and nestled at the edge of a dense forest. Growing up, I spent summers there playing in the fields and exploring the woods, but there was one part of the house I was forbidden from ever entering: the locked room in the basement. My grandpa was adamant about it. He would get serious any time I asked, simply saying, "It's for storage. Nothing to worry about." After his death, inheriting the house felt like a bittersweet blessing. It was old but sturdy and gave me the fresh start I desperately needed. I moved in during winter when the days were short and the nights stretched endlessly. Everything about the house felt familiar, comforting even, until I went down to the basement. The door was still there, heavy and imposing, with its rusted lock intact. I told myself I wouldn't open it. It wasn't my business, and I had no reason to disturb it. But over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I went downstairs to do laundry or grab tools, it was like the door was calling to me. I started noticing odd things too. Sounds of movement coming from the basement late at night, the distinct feeling of being watched when I passed by the door. One particularly cold night, after hearing faint knocking from below, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a crowbar, I forced the lock open. It took a few tries, but the door eventually creaked inward, revealing a dark, musty room. The first thing that hit me was the smell, a mix of old wood, rust, and something metallic that made my stomach turn. The room was bare except for a single chair, bolted to the floor in the center, facing a wall covered in deep scratch marks. Shackles hung from the arms of the chair, worn smooth like they'd been used often. My stomach churned as I took it all in, but what truly terrified me was the pile of Polaroid photos scattered at the base of the chair. I picked one up. It was a picture of a young man tied to the chair, his face twisted in fear. The next photo showed a woman, screaming, her wrists bound by the shackles. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pictures. Each one showed a different person, some terrified, others seemingly unconscious, all in the same chair. A sudden creak behind me made me freeze. I turned, expecting to see someone there, but the room was empty. Still, the air felt heavy, suffocating, as if something unseen was watching me. I bolted upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. That night, I barely slept. I heard faint footsteps pacing below, slow and deliberate. At one point, the door handle jiggled as though someone or something was trying to get out. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching a kitchen knife, too afraid to move. When I finally mustered the courage to check the basement the next morning, the room was completely empty. The chair was gone, the photos were gone, and even the scratches on the wall had disappeared. The only sign that something had been there was the broken lock lying on the floor. I sold the house a few weeks later and never looked back. But sometimes late at night, I wake up to the sound of footsteps pacing in my hallway, and I wonder if whatever was in that room followed me. 2. The Forgotten Hiker. 2 years ago, my friends and I decided to spend the winter holidays in a remote mountain cabin. We were looking for an adventure, something different from the usual holiday chaos. The cabin was miles away from civilization, perched on the edge of a frozen lake and surrounded by towering pine trees. The first few days were magical. We went sledding, built snowmen, and even tried ice fishing. The cabin was rustic but cozy, with a wood-burning stove and a stack of old board games. It felt like the perfect getaway until the snowstorm hit. By the third day, we were completely snowed in. The power had gone out, and the snow was piled so high against the windows that we couldn't see outside. It was then that the strange noises began. Every night, we'd hear footsteps crunching in the snow outside the cabin. At first, we thought it might be an animal, but the sound was too deliberate, slow, heavy, and circling the cabin like someone was walking a perimeter. On the fourth night, we found an old journal tucked away in the attic. It belonged to a hiker who had stayed in the cabin decades ago. The entries started out normal, detailing his journey through the mountains, but they grew more frantic as the days went on. He wrote about finding tracks in the snow, about feeling like he was being followed. His final entry read, "It's out there, watching, waiting. If anyone reads this, do not answer the door. No matter what you hear, Do not let it in. That night, the footsteps returned, louder and closer than ever. At around midnight, there was a knock at the door. It was soft at first, then more insistent. A man's voice called out, "Help me. Please, I'm lost." We froze, remembering the journal. None of us dared move, but the knocking grew more frantic. "Please let me in. I'm freezing," the voice cried. One of my friends, Kyle, moved toward the door, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't. It could be whatever's out there," I whispered. Suddenly, the voice changed. It became deep, guttural, almost inhuman. The knocking turned into heavy pounding, shaking the door on its hinges. Then came the growling, a low, menacing sound that seemed to reverberate through the entire cabin. We huddled together, too scared to even breathe. The pounding continued for what felt like hours before it suddenly stopped when we finally dared to look outside in the morning. There were no footprints in the snow, just long, deep claw marks leading away from the cabin and into the forest. We left that day, trekking through waist-deep snow to find help. I'll never forget the look in Kyle's eyes as he whispered. It sounded just like my dad. 3. The room that wasn't there. I moved into a cheap apartment in the city after landing my first job. It wasn't fancy, but it was affordable and close to work. The place was small, just a bedroom, a bathroom, and a narrow hallway leading to the kitchen. It was nothing special until I noticed the door. At the end of the hallway was a door I hadn't seen before. It was plain, unmarked, and locked. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was a maintenance closet or an unused storage room. But over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. At night, I'd hear faint whispers coming from behind the door. They were too quiet to make out, but they sent chills down my spine. One morning, I found the door slightly ajar. I was sure I hadn't touched it, but when I looked inside, the room was pitch black, like the darkness was alive. Things escalated quickly. I'd wake up to find furniture moved, lights flickering, and once I found claw marks gouged into the walls of my bedroom, the whispers grew louder, sometimes calling my name in a voice that sounded eerily familiar. I finally asked my landlord about it. His face went pale. "There's no door at the end of your hallway," he said. Confused, I brought him to my apartment. But the door was gone, replaced by a blank wall. That night, the door returned. It was wide open, and something was standing in the doorway, a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. It stepped toward me, and the last thing I remember was screaming before everything went black. I woke up the next morning outside my apartment, the door to the building locked. I never went back, but I still dream about that door. And in those dreams, it's always open.